Hey folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the debut album from Avicii titled True. There are certain acts to which I don't really feel qualified to review, often for a number of well-considered reasons. I don't touch classical music or jazz, mostly because I'm largely unfamiliar with the genres and I don't feel remotely qualified to talk about them. Similarly, there are whole swaths of heavy metal I would like to review, but I just haven't had the chance to become familiar enough with the best and worst of the genre to speak definitively on the subject. Yeah, I'm working my ass off to catch up, but until then, I don't think I'm the best reviewer anywhere to speak to, say, the new Motorhead album or the new Carcass album or that Death Heaven album that came out earlier this year and received a ton of critical acclaim. And of course there are genres like metalcore and electronic core, which I've listened a fair amount of it, and thus I cannot be remotely objective when talking about these acts. And for a long time, one of the genres I've hesitated to talk about was EDM, partially because I didn't think I was familiar enough with the genre, partially because I didn't particularly like most of which I had heard, and partially because as a critic, I tend to spend a fair amount of time analyzing lyrics. I'm a published author, that's one of my bigger strengths. And since most trance and house and EDM don't really have lyrics, I find myself guessing more than I'd like when I review those albums, because the review is less based on solid content and more based upon mood and emotion, and thus there'd be a limit to how much real analysis I'd be able to provide when reviewing the act, at least on a literary terms. But as of recently, there's been something of a shift, mostly due to EDM-inspired music moving more towards the mainstream, with the success of acts like Zedd and Swedish House Mafia and David Guetta and Calvin Harris. What I find as a significant relief is that a lot of this music has vocals and lyrics, often not very well written lyrics, but they are there in order to better court the mainstream. And thus, when I heard about Swedish DJ Avicii's debut album not only containing vocals and lyrics, but also an exploration into folk and country music, I gotta be honest, I was really psyched about that. Not only would I have some real lyrics to examine, I'm also significantly more familiar with folk and especially country music. For once, I felt that there was an EDM album that might fit within my area of expertise, and I was really looking forward to reviewing Avicii's True as of that fact. So, what did I find? Oh boy, forget about lyrics, we got something you don't see enough of on the charts these days. An album that has some serious ambition behind it to overcome a real problem and a real challenge, and the thing is, it nearly surpasses that challenge, and then fails for a completely different reason that I don't think anybody could have seen coming. On that note alone, I'm almost in a mind to recommend Avicii's True, mostly because you don't get albums in this vein very often, and it's a perfect example of how huge ambition can blow up in your face if you don't consider all of those little details. I have to explain this, and first I need to start with a basic explanation of production standards in folk and electronica, because this album breaks on its production. Characteristically, folk is primarily an organic genre of music, with guitars and banjos and fiddles and so forth. The best production of this sort in music emphasizes how each element blends together in order to create that melody, perhaps with the drums keeping the tempo and additional instruments creating the harmony line. And if they're looking for that sound to feel heavier or richer, a good producer will ensure that the texture of the instrumentation, despite that blend of sounds, isn't lost, and that the combined instrumentation has just the right production to gather that burnished, organic swell that is almost unique to the genre. Folk and country music at their roots are more concerned with sincerity and authenticity, after all, over polish and shine, which is why so many fans of the genre have turned against the more polished production in modern country, or against acts like Mumford & Sons, who have co-opted the folk image, but not the texture that comes with it. Now, electronica, on the other hand, is a more synthetic genre. Now, the breadth of sounds you can create here is mind-boggling, so I'm going to instead try to focus on the EDM that has gotten popular lately. You all know the sounds, a pounding beat either at the top or the bottom of the mix, a synth-driven melody line, perhaps another few layers to produce a harmony, but I want to talk about the production here. Given that most EDM is produced without organic instrumentation, the production tends to be very clean and very crisp. The beats precisely layered on top of each other courtesy of synthesizers and drum machines, and since most modern EDM is rougher and fuzzier with a lot more static, more of the sounds tend to blend together into just a cacophony of loudness. But even with that, the production is still very much hi-fi. It's clean, it's polished, and while the best producers can still make something of an organic sound from this, the modern EDM scene is very much rooted in inorganic instrumentation that sounds very clean and very polished, which is almost a sharp contrast from the organic or almost lo-fi instrumentation common in folk and country. So now you should all see the challenge that Avicii set upon himself, combining two genres that not only just don't go together lyrically, but on a production and instrumental standpoint as well. And really, He's towing a delicate line here, trying to combine the rich, organic instrumentation of folk with the pounding dance beats of EDM and somehow managing to make it sound cohesive. And furthermore, he's not just looking to make high-energy dance jams like which were done in the mid-90s with acts like Rednecks, instead opting to go for the sweeping, serious, emotionally evocative material that has grown popular in the mainstream, and is at least a better tonal fit for folk and country, but is much more difficult to pull off. It's really hard to synthesize sincerity, and yet that's the task that Avicii has given himself. And you know, the sad thing is that he almost made it work, and he got there by doing everything right. He recruited great singers with a reputation for rich, powerful vocals with a lot of personality and texture, and he got organic guitars and banjos and strings and even the occasional set of organic drums. And most of the time he gives the folk-esque production to make it work, with the appropriate reverb and the chance to let the instrumentation swell and fill the mix and give it some real presence. And yeah, sure, the songs are underwritten, but the lyrics occasionally do have a fair amount of weight and impact thanks to great delivery. A simple song can still be delivered very, very well, and while the lyrics are characteristic to EDM, being a little bit too simple for my taste, they do come out very well here. Avicii knows his production for folk, and it's easily these elements that I enjoyed most upon this album. And thus, it's kind of sadly ironic that the majority of the problems from this EDM DJ's attempt to combine folk with EDM come from the electronica side of the production. I'm serious here. The majority of my issues with this album come from Avicii's side of the production booth, which really surprised even me. Now I'll start with the most minor of gripes here. Even though Avicii's attempts to transition between folk and electronica are probably better than nearly any other attempt I've ever heard, he still hasn't quite nailed it, and there are definitely points where the transition sounded like an audible thud to me. What's all the more troublesome that his attempts to place folk vocals opposite electronica vocals, and then there's this dichotomy between production of this vocals that is just jarring to say the least. I think that some of this could have been resolved by having a midpoint where the vocal production was the same for both singers on the mix, but that leads straight to my next issue, where the production shifts are more notable are in the vocal production, as there are points where the reverb saturated folk production for the vocals is almost lo-fi is abruptly switched to a much higher quality vocal recording, and it isn't a clean shift. Now, these are all problems with transitions. These are issues that were inevitably going to come up when this particular blend of genres. But what's more worrisome are the problems with Avicii's electronica mixes themselves, and I'll start with the most noticeable one, that of the melody line. Now don't get me wrong, at points that he does manage to choose a synth that reasonably matches the organic instrumentation for the EDM-inspired segments of the songs. And I will definitely give him praise for the melody shifts between synthesizer and an organ, which are a natural fit and work really well together. But in other cases, we get an electronica sound that comes probably most closely approximated to that of a kazoo. And really, if you're looking for a way to completely derail the emotional and serious impacting nature of your songs, the braying of a kazoo would leap to the top of the list, at least for me. But even on the songs that did manage to have a solid electronica line, I had the niggling feeling that the songs just still weren't working for me. So I went back and listened to the one electronica song I knew that managed to blend acoustic guitar with EDM fairly well. A dance remix of Bryan Adams' Heaven by DJ Sammy. And it hit me pretty much immediately. What worked so well about that song and the biggest problem that I have with Avicii's True? Balance. The reason why DJ Sammy's Heaven worked so damn well is because the acoustic melody line was just a natural fit, when the backbeat supported that melody line while keeping the song breezy and lightweight. And the problem that I have with Avicii's True is that in the majority of the cases, the backbeat is incredibly weak. It's brittle, it's thin, it doesn't very little to support the mix, and it certainly doesn't balance well against the richer, more powerful folk instrumentation and vocals. Worse still is that the beat is often placed at the very top of the mix, where it lacks any force to truly drive the electronica, placing all of that weight on the melody line, which often doesn't have the force to push the song forward, particularly in comparison with the folk instrumentation, which has a ton of rollicking energy that would be sufficient on its own. Now, I get why Avicii did this. He didn't want to have his organic instrumentation to be overwhelmed by the electronica, which is the consistent problem you get with DJs like Calvin Harris. But the problem with this album is that it flips the balance in the opposite direction and undercuts that emotional buildup you get from the folk segments, particularly when you lose the lyrics and any sort of emotional poignancy that they might be building throughout the breakdown. Now, it's not much to be fair, but the vocals from Mac Davis and Aloe Blanc are good enough to build investment on delivery alone, so It's a real failure here in execution on the electronica side. It's just tilted way too much in the other direction. So yeah, with all that in mind, can I recommend Avicii's True? Well, yeah, I actually can. In my eyes, it's still something of a failure, but at least it's a compelling one, and albums that fail due to overambition are far more interesting than albums that fail because they didn't try. And with that in mind, I'm gonna have to give this album a 6 out of 10. Look, it's far from perfect, but it's an interesting experiment, and it definitely got me curious to see how Avicii might further develop this project. He's definitely heading in the right direction, that's for sure, and I'd be excited to see more. And look, do I think we'll ever get that blend of EDM and folk? In all due honesty, I haven't heard it yet, and I don't think we're gonna get it anytime soon. But Avicii, well, he got pretty damn close. So yeah, if you'd like to like and subscribe, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you'd like to provide any comments about what you might want to hear next or anything I might be able to better do to improve my presentation, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, see you next time.